In this presentation, I will briefly address the issue of resource consumption that is part of the supervision layer. The term itself refers to code and data structures that we use to monitor the internal operation of the system when it comes to measuring how many times, for example, some computational operation like merge is executed, or how many phrase structure representations are constructed during the derivation of some sentence. Anything like that. And there are at least three reasons why this is useful. One is simply that when our theory and the whole infrastructure becomes more complex, we lose the ability to grasp its internal operation and fully understand what it's doing. And even if the supervision layer would be and is providing us a derivational log file, which is in essence a record of everything the model is doing, this file itself is so huge. In the end, it will be so huge and complex object in itself that we really will have hard time to get a more general picture of what is going on. And so having this type of data available is interesting and also, in my view, quite useful. It gains insight into what kind of model it is that we have been creating. And the second reason is that at least some years ago, in the 90s, it was very popular to think that this type of resource consumption is part of the empirical theory. So in that case, it's not just part of the supervision layer. The idea was that the language faculty would always prefer derivations which consume less resources. Resources meaning things like computational steps overall, or number of computational steps overall, or perhaps the number of some specific operations that were considered very costly. So the idea was that the human brain is somehow trying to optimize its calculations. And so if we have this type of empirical hypothesis, and especially if we want to develop something like this and check it against data, then we would have to implement resource consumption. Then we have to calculate the consumption of resources and add the output to the empirical theory itself. It would be quite trivial to do. For example, when the derivational search function is creating derivations and delivers complete solutions, then in addition to the complete solutions, it would deliver an estimation of, or not estimation, but an exact measure of how much cognitive computational resources were consumed when that solution was produced. And then the system would reject some of these solutions on the basis that they are too costly or that there is more optimal version available. But I won't go into that. I don't believe myself that this is a realistic model, but it is an empirical possibility, and then automatically will lead us to try to measure the resource consumption. And the third reason, which is my main focus here and my own motivation, is that by measuring the resources, we can begin to develop psycholinguistically realistic theories of language comprehension and perhaps also production. Because this allows us to create an empirical model which makes predictions concerning real-time language processing. We create a system, which I will discuss soon, in which we associate the cognitive computational operations of the model with predicted with the amount of time, for example, these operations would consume in the real human brain in milliseconds. And then if our model is supposed to be psycholinguistically realistic, we can then, by presenting it with sentences, get predictions, let's say milliseconds, concerning how long it would take for an average person to process that expression. And we can test these predictions against laboratory experiments or existing data. For example, a typical garden path sentence. So if we show in the laboratory that native speakers enter into garden paths when processing that type of expressions, then in a psycholinguistic realistic comprehension model, say something that is based on a recognition grammar, for example, the model should also enter into the garden paths. And when it does so, it will automatically create more calculations when it's becoming to backtrack, or whatever is our theory of what happens when real humans enter into a dead end, when the parser doesn't find solutions or a solution. And if we have, if all the operations are linked with some type of measurement of how much they consume real resources in the human brain, let's say milliseconds, then the model would give us a predicted average processing time, which would be much higher for the garden path expressions than those which do not involve this type of difficulty. And so this would allow us to anchor our theory into the real world when it comes to real-time language processing and both comprehension and production. And we can also try to link this model with brain imaging data, because we can link the operations the model is doing with locations in the human brain where we see activation. And this would give us not only the temporal profile of our model, but also the location model. So for example, we can make a prediction that a type of processing of passive sentences and the operations that are involved, like move and the kind of how the language changes the thematic roles and grammatical roles in such expressions. These are difficult sentences for patients that have problems in the dominant hemisphere frontal, in the mainly language areas like Broca's area and the adjacent areas. So we can then have a model where we make a hypothesis about what type of grammatical operations are taking place in that area versus, for example, more the posterior or temporal areas where we seem to, my if I remember correctly, it was more about lexical and phonological and semantic processing. So we can associate those locations also with different operations or modules, and then we would the model would deliver also, it would deliver a temporal map of exactly millisecond by millisecond how the process is predicted to happen, but also in terms of the anatomical location. And so that when the model generates this type of predictions, we could justify those assumptions by comparing the predicted output with the observed reality we get from psycholinguistic, neurolinguistic, and neuroimaging research. So that to me seems worthwhile and interesting goal. Now, this is simple to do. In principle, the problem is, of course, to provide these empirically justified values for all this resource consumption and the localization, and that's something I'm not really an expert of, so I'm not going to discuss that issue here. I have used imaginary values simply to verify that the system works as I intended it. But the main principle is simple. It's that we create an abstract or general function in the supervision layer, which is called when some operation is executed. We do it automatically so that the operations have names or labels, and when some operation is executed, we simply know the label or the ID of some identifying string or number, whatever we want to use. And then we have a system which automatically records that operation has now occurred once, and it automatically increases the predicted resource consumption in milliseconds. And then when we do this in a very general way, then whatever operations we use, they will always be automatically recorded. I actually showed already that we can have this kind of function in derivational search function itself. So always when we pick some grammatical operation in the derivational search function, there is a call to other function called consume resource. And then the name of that operation goes into as an input to that function, and it will automatically add, okay, now this was executed one time. And then if we want to record the location or milliseconds, we handle it there. So let's look at my own Python implementation. This comes from my own model, which I'm using. It's not part of the scripts, but this is simple. So I have, first of all, I have here a model called results. It's part of the supervision layer, and it's a separate model which handles all raw output data collection. And so one of the output data then is a dictionary I call resources. This is the data structure in which all the resource consumption is stored. And the dictionary, as Python dictionaries are, is simply a list of keys. And the keys are, first of all, the names of all operations that I want to measure, like merge, I have chains, these are transformations, I have agreement, and other things like that. And then I have also here let's say ad hoc fields like total time, and I'm also measuring garden paths, how many times the algorithm enters the garden path before finding a solution. And each of these keys are mapped with another dictionary. Let's take the merge as an example. Here is the dictionary associated with merge, and this is the data structure in which I record the actual resource consumption. So there are now two fields, but if I would be interested in the locality information, I would add the locality assumptions here. I can explain it soon how I would do that. But here now I have two fields. Field 1 is how much I am assuming this operation consumes time in the human brain. And here I'm saying it consumes 7 milliseconds. This is totally a ad hoc number which I use simply to produce some kind of output. But in a real theory, if we had data from laboratory experiments, we would have to have some justification, in ideal case, some independent justification for this assumption. And then I have a field n, which measures the amount, the number of times this operation was executed. And this field is always updated by the function that measures resource consumption. So always when I execute merge, I add 1 here. And this milliseconds is added to the total time. And so on for anything that I want to measure. They go into this one dictionary. Now let's make one point before discussing how this can be used, this information. What about backtracking? Now, the problem here is that the backtracking, the derivational search function will do a full backtracking. It explores every possible derivation. And that information is not, that process is part of the executive layer, so it's neither empirically plausible or realistic, nor is it part of the empirical theory. So it makes no sense for me here to measure all the backtracking except for the garden paths. This is useful summary information. I want to know how, usually I use this now simply to understand how far I am from psychologically realistic model. Namely, if I give the system some perfectly canonical sentence and I get a lot of garden paths, then I know that psycholinguistically I'm completely off the mark. That's all I'm using this for. But the rest of these operations, it makes no sense to measure how many times I'm doing merge when I'm backtracking, because it just means that I'm exploring all possible derivations that the human mind would never do. So I'm actually only measuring these up until the first pass parse is discovered, namely up to the point where we have a first acceptable solution. Then I will stop adding or stop recording these variables. We could, in theory, implement backtracking also for resource consumption, so that every time I call the derivational search function recursively, we would be using its own resource consumption dictionary. But I see no point in doing that because the whole thing is psycholinguistically unrealistic. Well, what do we do with this information? What I do is that after each expression has been derived. We have found all the possible solutions or rejected the input as ungrammatical. I will add these numbers into our output data file where we have the expression. We have a one line there with the expression, and then all of these values from this table separated by some simple comma, for example. And then in that file I also write into the first line will contain all of these keys, the names of these columns, because then all the expressions will come under each other in a list. Each will have will associated with these actual numbers of how many resources were consumed and how many garden paths. So it creates this huge matrix where I have this information. And then I can open this data matrix in an external program, SPSS, MATLAB. I have used separate Python scripts. Python has good external libraries that can be used to analyze complex quantitative data matrices, and very good libraries that draw nice professional looking graphs and plots and will do statistical analysis. So the point is that this data here, it is sent to an external file that uses some format which is easy for other external programs to use, Excel also. So if I have a comma delimited data, each numerical value is separated by comma or tabulator or some other symbol such as this. They are easy to process into another external programs which are specialized for analyzing quantitative data. And this gets me summaries, statistical and visual summaries of how the program is performing. And at one point I also, in this file, and this is simple to do, you can provide a numerical classification for the input sentences, expressions. For example, we can have a numerical data field which tells that these expressions are active sentences, not passives, I mean in that sense. And then we could have another set of expressions which we decode as or classify as passives, or any other classification we are interested in. Or in Finnish we can have sentences where the word order is canonical and then other set of expressions where it's scrambled or non-canonical. That's a better example. So we provide numerical label or kind of create experimental groups. And this information is stored together into this resource consumption file together with the expressions themselves. So we provide like a classification of what type of expressions we have. And then we can analyze this quantitative data as a function of that classification. There can be several classifications. So we can see how the model is performing for canonical word orders and non-canonical word order. Performing in a sense of how much computational resources it needs, the system needs to process them. And if we are interested in psycholinguistic modeling, we can then match that data with observed reality from from how real speakers process similar sentences. For example, are they slower processing non-canonical word orders in Finnish? If they are, then our model should also provide, when we average all this quantitative data, we should see similar patterns. We should see some kind of increase in the processing times, predicted processing times that we see in the laboratory. Or, and this is something has been studied a lot, the processing of subject relativization and object relativization, the same point. We get the data from the laboratory from participants. We will have some average and summaries and statistical analysis or summaries from this individual performance. And then our model will measure the resource consumption as I just illustrated and create predictions also. And if it's psychologically realistic, then we should see that the object relativization is lower and consumes more resources than subject relativization. If the two match, then we would have a more rigorous justification for whatever psycholinguistic hypothesis we have posited into the theory.